there. Because if you've ever been on the receiving end of somebody's trying to share with you their concern, it's sometimes not very pleasant. And depending on how well you know that person, I have a saying that I use, which is earning the right to be able to correct someone. You know, at the end of the day, most of us would only have a few people in our lives that we would respect their opinion enough that if we were blindly walking into a dangerous situation, that we would take it well when they said, hey, watch out, danger's ahead. Now, I mentioned people before who cannot mow their lawns and my judgmental superiority about that. But I have actually been on the receiving end of a similar criticism. You see, when I was renting a house on the Sunshine Coast, it was a corner block, so unlike where I live now, that means if you ever buy a corner block, just realise you're getting double portion of front lawn there to mow. So beware of that. Sometimes they're a little cheaper, that's why. So I had this quite a big corner area to mow. And I didn't realise, but the property manager who was managing our house had been changed. And so I got a letter from this new property manager. Now, instead of it saying, you know what, we are now looking after your property, so we'd like to introduce ourselves, you know, if there's any problems or concerns, please let us know. No, that's not what it said. The letter said, we are now your property manager, and on a recent drive-by inspection, we noted that your lawn needs to be mowed. Now, was I thankful for that little tip? Yeah, it is getting a bit long, maybe I should mow it. No, I thought it was a bit rude because, you know, how dare they introduce themselves with a letter demanding I mow my lawn? In fact, I may have even mowed my lawn by the time I got the letter, because generally I keep on top of those things. But we don't always enjoy correction when we're on the other side of it. And that's why when Paul here says that we need to be gentle, and not just gentle, but not everyone should do it, those who are spiritual. And I have noticed in my short, not so short life, that in certain situations, there are situations that happen in a church, and there are people that feel they should say something. Now, in my experience, they are the last people that should say something, because often it's a life experience that touches them emotionally in a way that kind of triggers them in a way that they think they're being gentle, you know, like, boof, boof, boof. But I was gentle about it. And so we have to be careful of this, because when Paul says we need to be gentle, anyone who's been on the receiving end of correction knows the level of sensitivity required, and the reason why Paul is wise when he says we need to be gentle. It also highlights, I guess, the value of having a relationship with someone so that you do earn the right to be able to share some of those tough truths. But coming back to what Jesus says don't judge, but we've looked at a number of verses where Paul seems to be saying, yes, do judge, or at least be discerning. So how do we kind of make sense of this? Well, certainly there is an element of attitude, and I think this is important to recognise when it comes to judgment. You can have an attitude of judgment, a spirit of criticism, and you can probably think of people in your mind that sort of meet that category. Of course, none of us would ever think of ourselves in that light, because we are gracious people who look for the best in others. But the reality is we have blind spots. And even as Christians, there are things that we can be blind to. And, you know, I remember reading about denial when I was at college and studying about denial, and I could think of people who have lived in denial. But of course, I don't have denial because I am super aware of everything. But the problem with denial is you don't know, and that's what makes it so tricky. And I have sadly come through experiences in life now where I look back and I think, yeah, actually I didn't really want to acknowledge the truth there, but with hindsight I can see that I was in denial, as hard as that is to admit. But the bottom line is, when it comes to the example of Jesus, did Jesus draw or repel sinners? Have a think about it. He seemed to pull a pretty good crowd most of the time. Now, there were times where he did polarise people, and that's true. But generally, it seems that Jesus mixed truth and love in such a way that people were curious at least and wanted to know more. They saw in him some kind of solution that they couldn't find in themselves. And so, generally speaking, I think it's fair to say that sinners were drawn to Jesus, and it seems that Jesus was drawn to sinners. In other words, he went out of his way to mix with sinners. And yet, if Jesus was highly critical and judgmental, he would have just been so busy telling them all off all of the time that he wouldn't have had time to stay for the party or whatever he'd gone to attend. Even when Jesus confronted people, I believe he did it in love. Now, I think of a few examples in the Bible. Perhaps Peter is an example where Jesus, he didn't just neglect the fact that, Peter had denied him 3 times. And, oh, by the way, Peter, I've got an assignment for you. After I die, he already died, but at this point, when he confronted Peter, he could have just said, look, I've got this big sermon I want you to do, and you're going to preach to a lot of people, and, 2,000 people will be converted, so all good for that? Yep, sweet. No, Jesus didn't brush the truth aside. He didn't sweep it under the carpet. But when he confronted Peter, he did it with a certain gentleness. Peter, do you love me? Yeah, of course I love you. Peter, do you love me? Yeah, I already told you I loved you. Okay, then feed my lambs. Peter, do you love me? What's going on here? 3 times. Are you deaf? But I think there's significance in that Jesus was, I guess, in some ways addressing the 3 times denial with a 3 times asking Peter, did he love him? Did Peter know what Jesus was driving at? Yeah. Jesus could have taken a different tack. Peter, man, am I glad to see you. We need to talk, buddy. I told you you'd deny me, and you said you wouldn't. And what happened? What do you got to say for yourself, eh? Could have given him a good talking to. But Jesus had spiritual discernment. He knew when someone was sensitive and vulnerable about something, and so he replied with gentleness. And I believe Peter never forgot that encounter. But I also believe that Jesus had love in his eyes, and so when he interacted with Peter in such a way, Peter took on board what he had to say, and it was a stepping stone to greater things. I think of Jesus' interaction with the rich young ruler. Jesus could have said, hey, you, buddy. Yeah, you with all the money and fancy cars. Well, he wouldn't have said that because they didn't have cars back then, but, modern day equivalent. You guy, rich guy, you got so much money that, you think you're a goodie, you think you're a good little Jew and you've done all the right things ever since you were little, but I've got news for you, buddy. You need to sell up everything and then come and follow me, and then that'll show if you're really a follower of Jesus or not. But even Jesus doesn't do that. The guy who came to him, he asked questions. And in a gentle way, Jesus responds in love. And he doesn't neglect the fact that there is a barrier in that man's life that's keeping him from fully following Jesus. But he just gently prods. One thing you lack. How about this? And so, obviously, the guy got the point because he went away troubled. But again, we see Jesus interacting with people in a way that balances truth and gentleness and love and mercy and grace. And of course, I think the reason sinners were attracted and drawn to Jesus was because they saw in him a love and a grace that they could see that Jesus wanted the best for them. And so because of that, it was most conducive to their well-being. Of course, when it comes to sharing truth, we also have to think of a follow-up question. And some of you will have seen those. It's like an acronym, THINK, and each letter stands for something. And the first letter is it truthful? So obviously if it's not true or it's exaggerated, then that's a stop there. But one of the other aspects to consider is it helpful? Because sometimes what might be true is not always helpful. And of course, truth, when it's not mixed with a bit of grace and mercy, can come across as very harsh. And sometimes we grow up with a harsh, overbearing parent, and we either go to the opposite extreme where anything goes, or we're probably going to be a bit of that harsh parent to our kids as well. So patterns tend to kind of go from generation to generation. But it's always wise when you want to share some truth with someone to stop and think, is this going to be helpful? And I believe Jesus had the ability to discern what was going to be helpful and what wasn't. And you see that in his interactions with people. Jumping back to what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7, he continues on there with some other words of wisdom that give us insight. So you notice he starts off saying, "Do not judge, or you'll be judged with the same manner you judge others." And then in verse 3 he goes on to say, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take that speck out of your eye,' when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." Of course, it's so easy to criticize others and to be blind to our own faults because, again, we judge others by their behaviours, but we often judge ourselves by our intentions. So even when we get it wrong, I meant well. Those of you who are familiar with Brené Brown will be aware of the fact that she says, if you look at people from the perspective of they're doing the best they can under the circumstances, you're far more likely to be gracious about them. So my neighbours are doing the best they can with their lawns. So I should be more positive about how I think about that. Of course, the other thing as a Christian point of view that I can add to that is that if we truly experience the grace of God ourselves, we should have a degree of humility. Now, can you be judgmental and humble at the same time? Do those two go together? Now, it's not a trick question, but you ever think about it? Think about it, don't think about it for yourself because your own denial will prevent you from acknowledging this. But if you think about a friend of yours, if they were being judgmental, would they be also being humble? Probably not, eh? Because generally when we sit in judgment upon someone else, there is a little tone of superiority there that, you know what, if only they were as good as me, they wouldn't do that. But of course the challenge is, while we judge others by their faults, we often perceive ourselves by our strengths. So again, there's that inconsistency in how we see things. And I think this is what Jesus is hinting at. I think Jesus was trying to be funny here because it's a pretty ridiculous scenario. I've got a bit of 4B2 here. Lawrence, you got a little speck of sawdust there. I'll try and help you get that out. It's a funny sort of a word picture that Jesus uses. But he uses it to highlight the fact that we tend, as a habit, to be blind to our own errors. And we can be very easy to see other people's faults. And so it is, again, a warning to us from the Bible that we need to be super careful when it comes to seeking to correct others. How much of a duty do we have to correct others? And how much of it is the Holy Spirit's job to convict? Because there is a danger that we err more on the side of correcting others and less on loving them that sets up a potentially negative environment. And this is especially important in a church environment because anyone who comes into this church as a visitor, they will make judgments about us. They will discern our fruit. They will look at us and think, you know what, that's a really friendly church. Or, man, some of those people don't look like they've smiled in a long time. Of course, the fruit of the Spirit, there is one of them that's called joy. So as Christians, you are allowed to have joy. But it's important to recognise that what is the general tone or the culture of the church that we kind of project. And I think when people come to be a part of a church, you get a bit of that vibe when you come. And of course, it would be great, I think, if we were, as a church, to err on the side of grace, so that when people came, they thought, you know what, this is a safe place. Because when there's a lot of criticism around, what do? If you have areas of your life that you're struggling with, well, you sure as heck don't let anyone see them. So what happens is we become all very fake, and we pretend to be holy little people or good little people, and there's a problem with that, because God is in the business of truth and love. And it's actually dishonest if we all come to church and pretend to be something that we're not, because we're denying the truth of our own lives. The truth is, all of us here are sinners. The truth is, all of us here have certain sins in our lives that we struggle with, even after years of being a Christian. And this is what reminds us of the need to be humble when it comes to how we perceive others. Because while God is a God of love, all of us have challenges in our lives. And if we want to show God's love to those around us, then we need to emphasize grace and mercy so that people will feel that this is a safe place to come and learn about God. And then we view each other not so much as, ranking who's better or worse Christians. We look at each other as fellow travelers on the journey to find and explore what it means to come and know God and to be changed by God. And so then it's more of a team effort rather than a competitive environment where we try to bring as many people along as we can on the journey to be able to enjoy each other's company while we learn how to better follow God. So what kind of church do we want to be a part of? Do we want to be a critical church? Do we want to be a church where God's love and acceptance is evident? I believe that people are hungry to find a church where God's love is real. And I forgot to announce before, but there is a lunch this afternoon for people of uni-age students who are coming to Brisbane or in Brisbane at the Stacey's house at 1:30. If you need a lift, talk to Beck or Peter or myself. But the whole concept of that is often there's people that come in from the country, they have no church environment, and it can be a time where people, as they kind of have a lot of their beliefs that they grew up with challenged in that environment, can find a way outside of the church. But I would love for 8 Mile Plains to be a place where people that are coming from outside Brisbane, studying here, don't know many people, they know that if they come to this church, this will be a place where they'll be loved and accepted. This will be a place where it's okay to share their struggles because they know that there is grace and mercy to be found. Each one of us has to choose. What kind of Christians do we want to be? Do we want to be like Jesus, who seemed to be able to look at people through the eyes of mercy and grace? And even though they had things in their lives, he didn't feel the need to tell them straight away. Sometimes he was gentle with them. Sometimes he didn't even make a comment. It was interesting. I was reading that Sermon on the Mount reference in this book this morning, and the author makes the most interesting observation that I've never really thought about. All of the Jews that were listening to Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount, most of them had this preconceived idea from parts of the Old Testament that give this idea that the Messiah would come, throw out the Romans, and take over the world. That was the general kind of view of the time. And yet Jesus didn't correct that view. He didn't say, guys, I'm here to tell you I'm the Messiah and you have got this all wrong. Let me tell you how it's going to work. He didn't correct them at all. He highlighted who he was. He highlighted what he stood for. And he lived the example of demonstrating that in his own life. And so it's interesting that, there's a time to gently correct and there's a time to not even try, but just to define yourself, to be your Christian self and allow the example of that to speak for itself. And that's exactly what Jesus did when it came to that misunderstanding of what he was representing. And as time became clear what he actually stood for. And of course, there are a bunch of verses in the Old Testament that people tended to miss because they didn't see them, that were about the suffering servant and about the idea of Jesus dying, whereas there are other verses that sound more triumphal, which they'd focused on, which made them think that Jesus was going to come in and sweep through the place with a broom. So recognizing that all of us are human, all of us are a little prone to denial at times, all of us are a little bit Pharisee at times, I want to be aware of the fact that we can consciously choose to realize our own imperfections and to pray and ask for God to give us the eyes of Jesus so that when we encounter people, not only in the church, but also as we work with people, as we study with people, as we say hello to our neighbours, offer to mow their lawn, whatever it might be, that we might share the love of God as we interact with those around us. May we be people that draw sinners to us looking for help, rather than being people that can push people away because we have certain attitudes that come across as not being a place of grace and love and acceptance.
If you could stand as we sing our last song for today, Promises.
God of Abraham, you're the God of covenants and faithful promises. Time and time again, you have proven you do just what you said. Though the storms may come and the winds may blow, I'll remain steadfast and let my heart learn when you speak a word, it will come to pass. Great is your faithfulness to me. Great is your faithfulness to me. From the rising sun to the setting same, I will praise your name. Great is your faithfulness to me. God, from age to age, though the earth may pass away, your word remains the same. Your history can prove there's nothing you can do. You're faithful and true. Though the storms may come and the winds may blow, I'll remain steadfast and let my heart burn when you speak a word, it will come to pass. Great is your faithfulness to me. Great is your faithfulness to me. From the rising sun to the setting same, I will praise your name. Great is your faithfulness to me. I put my faith in Jesus, my anchor to the ground, my hope and firm foundation. He'll never let me down. Oh, I put my faith in Jesus, my anchor to the ground, my hope and firm foundation. He'll never let me down. I put my faith in Jesus, my anchor to the ground, my hope and firm foundation. He'll never let me down. He'll never let me down. Great is your faithfulness to me. Great is your faithfulness to me. From the rising sun to the setting same, I will praise your name. Great is your faithfulness to me.
Lord God,
We just want to thank you for your grace that each one of us has experienced. May we not be forgetful of the difference you've made in our lives. May we not forget that we would be nowhere without you. And may that give us a spirit of humility so that it's evident in the way we treat those around us, is our prayer today. In Jesus' name, amen.